Christians can do a pretty terrible job, if I'm frank, at representing their faith because they turn it into a tick box thing. Once you reduce Christianity to that, you lose Christianity.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being. Hello and welcome to the wonder and the mystery of being. This is episode 4. I'm already forgetting what number we're on, but I'm pretty sure it's episode 4. This episode is called The Art of Disagreement. And disagreement doesn't really sum up what we've been experiencing the last few months or few years, does it? I don't know about you all, but in the last few months, I have deleted probably 10 social media posts for every one that I've actually posted because I've had a thought and then been like, maybe not. Or I've had a thought and I'm like, yeah, I believe that, but is it worth saying? Or, you know, maybe I think it's something that is probably worth saying, but maybe I don't have the mental capacity to deal with what comes after saying it. All of that stuff. Yeah, many of you out there are probably feeling similar things. I don't personally remember a time where I felt like I encountered so much division, polarized views, so much tension in the sort of social fabric of my life. Maybe you have felt some of those same things. I do think that over the last year, the fact that we've been fighting this global pandemic, and one of the ways we've been fighting it is to isolate ourselves physically from each other and just not see people as much, not be as close to people. We're wearing masks, so we can't see facial expressions. There's been, over the last year, so many barriers put up between people. And that's made connection and conversation harder than it's ever been. And I honestly think that that's contributing to some of the tension. All of those things are making it harder for us to sit down face to face and have conversations that might be difficult to have, conversations where maybe we disagree a little bit. Doing that constructively and thoughtfully has gotten harder during the pandemic. And then on top of that, if you're in the US, we had an election year, which was, to me, it felt different than any election year ever before. The rhetoric was turned up to 11. Yeah, so with the election and the pandemic and all of the social issues that we sort of already had lingering in the ether, I guess, it's made for a very difficult time for almost everyone. And one of the things that's gotten harder for us to do is to engage thoughtfully with people who see things differently than we do. And I feel like now is as good a time as any to refocus our attention on ways that we can get better at doing that. One of the things I notice, if we're talking politically for a second, is that you've got 81 million people that voted for Joe Biden. You've got 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump, and a lot of the people on either side of that conversation don't want to engage with the other side of the conversation, or mostly want to engage with them by lobbing insults and blanket statements and generalities. And the problem there is that this country contains both of those groups. And we really actually need, everyone at least on the same page on some things in order to be a functioning society. And so we're going to have conversations with people that we disagree with. I know for me personally, I have friends and family members who see things differently than I do. And I need to get better at having thoughtful conversations with them. If I just lob insults and sort of blanket statements at them, I'm not going to have a family anymore. I'm not going to have these close friends. And my life is better with these people in my life than without. And so as we're in this new season now, we're entering into this new year. The election is behind us, as divisive as it was. I'm sure we're not done talking about it either. But I'm sort of refocusing my perspective on, how can I have the healthiest relationships possible with the people in my life that I value but disagree with? So how can I do that? And a few weeks ago, I recorded a conversation with a friend of mine named Justin Brierley that really might be helpful in this regard. So Justin Brierley is the host of a radio and podcast show called Unbelievable, and he's been doing the work of bringing together Christians and atheists to have hard conversations in a public space, like on the radio or on a podcast or on YouTube. He's been doing that for 15 years in various forms. And in my opinion, Justin is one of the most brilliant hosts and facilitators of those kinds of conversations. So I wanted to have a conversation with him because in many of the things that he posts and the conversations he hosts, that rhymed, he takes the role of sort of a neutral moderator. And while he is a Christian, he's a believer, he I think does a very good job of facilitating both sides of the conversation without sort of ganging up on anyone. So I wanted to have a conversation with him and ask him, like, how do you do that? What are some things that we can learn from the conversations that you have and the way that you host them? And I wanted to get a little bit more of an understanding of who he is and what his perspective is and how he, rides that fine line between inserting himself into the conversation with his opinion and then taking moments where he stands back and allows a conversation to unfold without controlling it too much. Maybe a skill that I could get better at, So anyway, I recorded this conversation a few weeks ago, but it feels as evergreen and relevant now as it did then. So I want to share this conversation with you. Please enjoy my conversation with Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me. I know that you are typically the one conducting interviews. And I really enjoy flipping that particular script and getting to know people that sometimes practice not putting themselves or their opinions out there too much. So thank you so much for participating in this.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and I love coming on other people's shows and podcasts. It's something I've done a lot more in recent years, I would say, especially since I published a book. But what I would like to say, John, first of all, is thank you for coming on my show twice in the past year. It's been so nice to get to know you both through those interviews, but also just chatting on social media, emailing each other. I've really appreciated everything you've brought to the Unbelievable show as well.
Oh, dude, thank you so much. So we first connected right after I sort of put out this Instagram post that I was finding that I no longer believed in God, and I was speaking in those terms and talking very openly about it. And you reached out to me to come on your show, like you said, and you also invited an apologist, a Christian apologist named Sean McDowell, who I've actually since become friends with, and we actually only live about an hour's drive away from each other. So we actually go running together occasionally.
I love that. That's awesome. So that doesn't often happen after a show, but I'm really glad it did in your case.
Yeah, it was cool. He's a great guy. So I appreciate that you connected us, and every time we've connected, I've been struck by your openness and your willingness to have conversations with people who feel differently than you do about things, who think differently about things than you do, and to specifically set out to create a space for those kinds of conversations, which in Christian culture, at least the Christian culture I grew up in, there wasn't always a space like that. And I just find that incredibly valuable. So you've been doing this show, Unbelievable, for 10 years or something like that?
Well,
or
more like 15, believe it or not.
Okay.
Actually. If you actually go from when we first started on air on Premier Christian Radio in the UK, it is actually 15 years. So It took a couple of years before we began the podcast, which is where the vast majority of people around the world actually listen nowadays. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it is quite unusual. I think Christians, wherever they are in the world, actually can live in a bit of a Christian bubble.
Yeah.
And don't always like that bubble to be popped too much.
Right.
Because there's a kind of safety, in surrounding yourself with people who essentially believe the same thing. I think it's probably easier to do that, if I'm perfectly honest, in parts of the USA than the UK, where you do have a much kind of larger Christian church-going population, especially, in the Bible Belt or wherever. But in the UK even, I would say Christians don't go out of their way to sort of bring in, skeptics to church to kind of challenge the congregation or anything like that. I guess we feel like there's plenty of skepticism on our doorstep anyway. But the whole point really of the show, though, was to acknowledge the fact that actually, at least here in the UK, a lot of our lives are lived cheek by jowl with people who don't share our faith. And kind of as a way of, initially at least, for Christians to help them to understand how to fruitfully engage with non-Christian friends, neighbors, family, and so on. And then, of course, once we actually started podcasting and reaching out well beyond the immediate radio audience, we started to suddenly pick up all kinds of atheist, agnostic, people of other faiths who listened to the show via podcast. And that was really exciting, because then it felt like we were becoming this kind of meeting ground for both sides. And that really kind of formed my role as a moderator, host of these discussions, to try and take both sides seriously whenever I was sitting down with people of different perspectives, and to feel the challenge. It's not always comfortable listening if you're a Christian, or indeed if you're an atheist or whatever. It's not sort of safe for the family kind of stuff. It's
sure
you will be challenged, and I think early on in the show, if I'm honest, there were some people, especially regular radio listeners, who said, "It's not for me. I can't handle it. I'm just going to avoid that hour on a Saturday afternoon when it happens."
Did you have people that sort of went beyond saying, I'm sure you did, have people that went beyond saying it's not for me and actually took that argument into like, you shouldn't be doing this? Did you have some of that?
Yeah, for sure. And I understood it as well, because there is that argument from a Christian perspective. Look, say you've got some new Christian, still very young in their faith, not sure about things. If they hear some, pretty ardent atheist on their Christian radio station making an argument against God, that could really shake the foundations of their faith or something. And I got that.
Right.
And in a sense, that's partly, though, my responsibility to make sure, if I do have a very cogent, compelling atheist on the show, that I equally have a cogent, compelling Christian who can put the other point of view. And in a way, I think I got enough positive feedback to very much outweigh the occasional negative feedback that came in. As I say, I think people who didn't like it just learned to tune out on that particular moment. But as I say, it was really the podcast where it started to take off, especially, and people, I think, appreciated that actually. It's almost like you learn how to listen to people who have a different perspective, and the more you expose yourself to it, the better you get at it. It's not even necessarily about learning the arguments for and against. It's more just like being able to sit and listen to different perspectives and not, have this knee-jerk reaction of fear, but to realize that's okay. They've got their perspective, I've got mine, and we're going to find a way to, we're not going to come to blows over this. We're going to find a way to sit down and talk about it. And if there are things that challenge me, that's just a challenge for me to go away and think about that and maybe come back and continue the conversation later. The problem is always when Christians or people of other perspectives sort of take it personally, and kind of have this kind of reaction of fear, and therefore I don't want to hear what that person has to say.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of bury your head in the sand approach. And I just don't think we can do that in culture. I think the church churches are only setting themselves up for a fall, and Christians, if they take that approach, bury your head in the sand. Because if they're not coming for you, they're coming for your children or whoever. They will meet skepticism, online, in their university, through their friends, whatever. You might as well present it to them at a point where actually there's a decent response on the other side as well. So that's the kind of approach I've taken with the show.
That's so great. That explains like probably 3 or 4 questions I had for you because one of my questions that I was wondering about is how you cultivate this approach because you're the moderator in most of these conversations. It's not that you're presenting yourself as the person, presenting the Christian view, and then you're having an atheist on. You're sitting in the middle of these 2 viewpoints. You're very good at guiding the conversation without being overly partial. I mean, everyone in the conversation knows that you're a Christian. So there's an understanding of that, but you're very good at not jumping in and trying to control the conversation too much. You're very good at letting it unfold. Is that something you had to practice? Is that something that came naturally to you? Because I imagine it would be hard.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is something that I've learned over the years. I'm so fortunate, really, that I had several years, I think, of relatively little exposure before it kind of really took off in podcast terms. And by that time, I think I'd learned, the basics of how to chair the discussions. We sometimes like pull an old archive show out of the archive and I listen back to them and I cringe a little bit I hear myself like 10, 11, 12 years ago and think, oh man, I would have done a better job on it this time around. But anyway,
it's funny. Music is like that too. Like, I was, in Hawk Nelson for 15 years and, we'd put out music and then we'd go play shows and someone would be like, oh, I loved your song, blah, 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 blah. And it would be a song from like 10 years ago. And I, for a time, I was like, oh yeah, that's like, oh, cringy. That's sort of embarrassing. But then it sort of like comes back around, and like now when I hear our early stuff, it's sort of nostalgic in this way that I'm sort of like, well, that's where we were at the time,
But there was definitely that temptation, as you say. There always is that temptation, I suppose. It doesn't go away to leap in, to sort of, for your perspective to potentially dominate. And I think I did have to learn just to hold back and let the guests do the speaking.
Yeah.
My job was to facilitate it, to try and make sure both had an equal share of time to move the subject on if we felt we were getting stuck in a rut.
Yeah.
And so on. And I haven't done this consciously, but lots of people have commented, especially in the last few years, that what they like about what I do is sort of recapitulating the points to the guests. So maybe someone's done like 5 or 6 minutes chatting, and I could just sort of say, so what do you make of that?
Yeah.
But what I quite often do is, so what so-and-so is saying is X, Y, and Z, and just in a sort of 20 seconds kind of try and spell out the point. And then that kind of primes the person to respond. And I hadn't really, in all honesty, noticed myself doing it until people started pointing it out.
Yes, it's very effective. Yeah.
And I'm glad it is. What I don't want to do is kind of get in the way. That's the point. And I think that's the job of any interviewer, or host in this case, a discussion host is not. The problem is always when you've got a third party trying to put all their opinions into it, and people really just came for the two guests, not for the host. I get plenty of chance otherwise to share my opinion. So I'm just trying to make sure the conversation flows, and that's my job really.
Right. I mean, that technique that you sort of found yourself stumbling into, it's actually sort of, it strikes me as a version of a steel man because, and for those that are watching and listening, a steel man is a sort of a debate term where you restate your opponent's or someone else's perspective in the strongest possible way. It's
kind of the opposite of a straw man, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So what feels effective about what you're doing is sometimes, I've been guilty of this. You go on someone's show and you go to make a point, and then you realize at some point that you've been talking for 3 or 4 minutes and you're not sure you've landed the point. And so, people like yourself will sometimes, and I'm sure you've done this with me in conversation. Not that I can remember a specific time, but where, you'll say, okay, well, John, what I'm hearing you say is this, and then you'll restate your perspective on what you believe that I just said. And it gives me a chance to either say like, oh yeah, that's right. Or, oh no, you've missed something here.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere, I can't remember where I got this idea, that like when you have arguments or, debates or discussions or conversations, whatever you want to call it, when you have those and both people are willing to use that technique, it's so much easier to get somewhere because you're eliminating. It's like before I pass the baton to you, or before I receive the baton is actually more accurate. Yes. Let me make sure I understand what you're really saying and not just respond based on a characterization of like a caricature of your point.
Indeed.
And it's
I think that's really helpful as well, isn't it? Because I mean, it's been said far too many times already, but we are losing the art of civil conversation.
Yes.
And so often all that you actually see on social media or in, broadcast media often is just people creating straw men of each other and basically just scoring points off each other. And I'm all for sort of a feisty exchange. I don't mind that, but I do want it to be an exchange where you're genuinely interacting with the position the other person has.
Yes.
And I think it's a really helpful technique you've just described there of actually offering back to that person. So let me just check that I've understood you correctly, what you're saying is. And then exactly you can then say, yeah, well, no, not quite that, but or whatever. And I think that's a great way to, otherwise you end up with discussions, and this has certainly happened in Unbelievable, where people do talk past each other.
Yes.
And you feel like you're never quite getting anywhere because neither side is kind of really actually engaging with the points the other person's trying to make. So,
and I think the audience can pick up on that, like I think people get frustrated when they hear those kinds of conversations because it's like we're not getting anywhere. Everyone's preaching to their own choir, and if you're a member of this side of the conversation, or if you identify with this point of view, you might be excited about a couple points that your guy lands. But at that point, it's like you're watching a football game, right? Yeah. And no one's learning anything. So
I tell you what I've noticed, actually, interestingly, in when it comes to public kind of discourses on platforms and things, going back 10 years or more, there was a real kind of thing for Christians and atheists to do big platform debates, I'll have 20 minutes, rebuttals, cross-examination, all this very kind of formal in style. But I think people started to tire of that because it did just feel like a performance, a little bit like whoever's got the best technique essentially wins rather than And so I hardly ever see those format actually happen these days. People have much more gone in the direction of what we've always done on the show, really, which is the conversational format. So these days, generally speaking, whenever those kinds of things happen, they tend to happen more in a kind of sit down conversational format. And I think that's far more natural. That's how conversations happen in real life. And it doesn't kind of mean that everyone feels the obligation to like tick off 5 things that person said and they now have to respond to 5 things, and which turns it into a kind of boxing match of sorts. Whereas when you have more of a conversation, you just naturally move on and you won't cover all the ground, but you do at least get something that's far more of a genuine engagement. So I've been encouraged at least in that way.
Yeah. And I've seen that happen even at a large scale. So, I mean, when you're describing that, what I thought of immediately is those conversations that were quite public between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris.
Yeah, exactly.
And they had, I think, 4 of them.
Yeah.
Which, were like 1 to 2 hour conversations on a stage in a city with a packed audience. And it was the kind of thing that you could have seen like 10 years ago. They may have structured as a debate, but here they structured it as a conversation. And it was, I thought, incredibly interesting to watch. I mean, I've watched all 4 of them multiple times because what you see is both Jordan and Sam were doing that thing that you're talking about. Like, hey, let me see if I understand your point correctly.
Yes, yeah.
And I think actually one of the episodes, well, like one of those events, they started by doing a full-on steel man of each other's position.
That's right. Yeah, I remember that.
Was super interesting. So I appreciate
and thousands of people turning out to watch two people have a conversation on stage. I mean, there were no pyrotechnics, there were no smoke machines. It was just interesting that people just genuinely, when there were two really interesting characters, wanted to just hear them chat. And that gives me some encouragement, actually, given how often we, bemoan the lack of proper civil conversation in our culture anymore. The fact that I think there's a real desire out there for having those kind of substantive kind of conversations. So, and as you know, we launched Unbelievable's always had that format, but we specifically launched a special series of shows called The Big Conversation.
Right.
For that very purpose, to have those kinds of characters, the Jordan Petersons, the Sam Harrises, to sit down and have those sorts of conversations together is the idea, rather than the kind of the debate or echo chamber type of stuff that often happens.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you've sort of led in this area and been a really great example of facilitating difficult conversations. And so I was actually really I'm really interested when you when you put out your book, because I felt like from watching you on YouTube or listening to a podcast or whatever, I was always sort of curious to know more about what you thought. And when I read, you very graciously sent me your book, so thank you for doing that. And I wanted to reference it here today, and I even made lots of notes in it. But on Twitter, I had an interaction with someone who was interested in your book, and so I sent my copy to them.
You're too generous. I'll have to send you another one now.
But what I noticed in your book, C.S. Lewis is maybe one of my favorite authors of all time. And I sensed a real sort of C.S. Lewis type spirit in your perspective. There's a kindness and a humility. There's an openness to being like, hey, this is what I think right now. I can't be certain of all this stuff, but this is just how it appears to me. And that tone is so refreshing and unique. And I wanted to ask you, positions are important. It's important to know what your position is on certain things. But I'm of the view that posture is equally important if you actually want to have a conversation. So maybe
I completely agree.
Yeah, maybe if you could sort of expand on, what caused you to want to write the book, what that process looked like for you, and how you found that the ability to strike that tone.
Yeah. Well, it's so very kind of you to compare me to C.S. Lewis, and I'll take the compliment, but I'm nowhere near in the league of Lewis himself. But I've been hugely influenced by Lewis, and for some of the reasons you say, just his ability as a wordsmith, the way he is able to bring clarity to issues through the use of analogy. I think he's almost unsurpassed in that way. But really, for me, the reason for wanting to write the book was a similar kind of motivation to Lewis, in as much as I am a Christian, and I believe in this kind of Lewisian idea of mere Christianity, that actually we can put forward a case for Christianity that in broad strokes is, if you like, relatively simple. There are obviously many doctrinal differences that may divide Christians of different stripes, but at the core of it, I believe there are some foundational truths that we hold in common. And the question is, can they be defended? Do they make sense? So I'd been hosting the show for about 10 years at the point where I started to think about writing a book. And I had been on a huge journey myself of sorting through issues. I mean, I started Unbelievable with really knowing nothing. I mean, even the word apologetics wasn't a word I really sort of thought of or understood at the time I started the show. But I quickly understood that what I was doing was a form of apologetics, i.e. defense of the Christian faith, but in this sort of, dialogue format. And along the way, I learned an amazing amount from both the Christians and non-Christians who came on the show. And I suppose I started to formulate my own sort of way in which, if someone asked me, why do you believe what you believe, the way in which I would, defend or make the case for my faith. And so the around the 10-year mark of the show, I did a sort of Ask Me Anything type edition of the podcast. And one of the main questions that came in from people, both Christians and non-Christians, was, having had all these conversations with well-known skeptics and atheists, hearing all these objections, why are you still a Christian? And I sort of tried to answer that a little bit in the podcast, but I thought, well, what if I wrote a book sort of saying why, well, as the title of my book says, why after 10 years of talking with atheists, I'm still a Christian. So that's really been what the book does. It tells the story of the show, why we did kind of very much covering some of the ground we've covered, about wanting to give Christians and non-Christians the opportunity to kind of re-engage in civil conversation, but also then sketching out the lessons I've learned and some of the reasons, hopefully presented in a reasonably humble way, not saying this is the only way to think about it, but to say here's why I've still found Christianity to be a compelling explanation of the world, why the ways in which I've sort of set it against, particularly, I suppose, atheism, naturalism, and why I find the atheist naturalistic worldview to not be as satisfactory explanatorily as Christianity is. Now, of course, all of the arguments I make there in the book have been debated endlessly on the show, and there are many, rejoinders and responses that I haven't been able to cover in the book. But it's really just, as you say, at that point in time, at least, me putting down where I stood on it and the reasons it makes sense to me, and then trying to sort of really, by the end of the book, paint not just an argument, not just an intellectual argument for Christianity, because I think apologetics is often, that's all it is sometimes. It's just a sort of, here's an intellectual argument, now you have to change your mind. But I think actually apologetics at its best is actually more about trying to show someone not simply that they should believe, but why it's attractive, why you would want to believe this. And I tried towards the end to sort of help people to think of it as sort of stepping into a particular stream, a particular way of viewing the world. And that's a challenge, I think, because as you said, it's one thing to say something. The way you say things, though, makes a huge difference. And that's not just, showing gentleness and respect as it says in 1 Peter 3:15, but the idea of actually presenting this as an option that makes someone wish it were true, even if they don't believe it's true, they wish it was true. And I think that's a huge challenge to apologists, because I think that's the bit of apologetics that frequently gets left. And I think what Lewis did brilliantly, and that's why Lewis has stood the test of time, because he didn't just explain why logically he believes Christianity is true. He made you want it to be true when he wrote Narnia, or when he made that for me is the big difference.
Dude, I'm so with you there. That is that's a really beautiful idea. I resonate with that too a lot, because even in my journey of questioning God and wondering what the truth of reality is, I find myself going back to C.S. Lewis, and it's actually not mere Christianity that influences me the most. It's the Great Divorce, because that's a picture of heaven and hell that is so unique and interesting. And I know he draws on George MacDonald a good bit in that story. But the thing I keep coming back to with the Great Divorce is just this idea that the thing holding all of us back from goodness is our own fixation on something that probably started good, but was not capable of being the ultimate good in our lives. And in the Great Divorce, it's just, you see story after story of someone clinging to one thing and missing all of this. And I see that truth as something like that jumps out to me as something that like we can all agree is true, right? It's like it is so easy to get fixated on one thing and miss this like vast expanse of goodness that's in front of us. And that's convicting for me. And it made me in my sort of spiritual journey go like, I don't want to get so fixated on these technical arguments for and against God. I mean, that stuff is important to think about, but I don't want to get so fixated on it that I miss the sort of, I mean, this is what I'm calling this show, but that I miss the wonder and the mystery of being. Because it is sort of mysterious why, why are we here at all?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I just think, like you, Christians can do a pretty terrible job, if I'm frank, at representing their faith because they turn it into a tick box thing. And it's not that I'm saying doctrine isn't important and that, statements of belief aren't important, but once you reduce Christianity to that, you lose Christianity. It's like that's, you've got the wrapping but not the thing inside it. And for me, I find the same. I find actually that Lewis was speaking just as much to Christians as non-Christians when he wrote that book, the Great Divorce, of people who get so tied up in investing themselves in a particular thing. And it could be a Christian thing, a thing that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could be some work of charity. It could be some great doctrine that they have to defend or whatever it is. But you can end up, not seeing the wood for the trees because you forget, to use another biblical phrase, your first love, the thing that actually inspired that to begin with. And I think idolatry in that sense, to use another biblical word, is such a danger and has been in the Christian community. I mean, don't even get me started on the forms of idolatry that currently exist in the USA in certain Christian circles. But it's so easy to kind of suddenly lose your way and find yourself obsessing about something which, when you stand back and look at it, you think, God, goodness me, that doesn't feel or smell like Jesus anymore. It feels like a particular hobby horse. Do you know what I mean? Right.
I mean, I even remember in my time in the band, I remember reading the story of Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. And I remember reading that being like, well, that sounds kind of like our merch table. like, are we doing that? Like, if we were in this story, where would we be? I think we might be the merchants, and you touch on a really good point, because I've thought about this a lot, because there are things within Christianity that I find unspeakably beautiful. But I see expressions in Christian culture where I sometimes go like, is that an expression that's making something that could be good but not prepared to be ultimate? Is it making one of those things ultimate? And using the word idol, I think is appropriate at times. I think the idol that I sort of find myself reacting to the most is sort of the idol of certainty. And what I notice is what's bringing me sort of back to questions of spirituality and faith and God and all this stuff is the mystery of it. And when I see this attempt to sort of explain absolutely everything, it actually leaves me feeling a little cold. Like that's not faith to me anymore.
You're preaching to the choir here, because I mean, the problem so frequently what I've experienced in especially having conversations with ex-Christians, and I'm not putting you in this category.
I don't know where I'm at in that, John, man.
I guess what I'm saying is, frequently what I found has happened is that someone has been raised in a form of Christianity that is so precise in what you have to believe about the first chapters of Genesis or X number of issues about the way you interpret scripture, that it's almost set up to fail, because this certainty is built into the system. And if you have any level of doubt about any of these very specific doctrines that are all spelled out so meticulously, then Christianity is not true. And if that just absolutely sets, because it turns Christianity into this thing that if you take that one card out from the bottom of the pack of cards, the whole thing comes falling down, and it turns faith into a very brittle thing. The certainty acts against itself almost, because you have to work so hard to refute anything that challenges, and that's not the way life works. So that's why, as I say, I believe in a kind of mere Christianity, but I take this view that actually I know so little. I'm constantly learning, constantly refining where I stand on things, but always holding it in a way where I'm not proclaiming this is the final sort of picture on the thing. And for me, there's so much humility that needs, we need a dose of to remember that there's a huge amount of mystery. I mean, who can really understand the incarnation, the crucifixion, the atonement? We're kind of like, I think we'll get to the other side of eternity and we'll find we were just literally scratching the surface of something that goes miles down, and we'll all look a bit foolish in our attempts to say we understood this, we had this, So I think, yeah, absolutely, I'm a big fan of
that's a beautiful picture. I literally said to my wife maybe the night before, but very recently, I said, if there's anything on the other side of this life, I think that when we get there, we'll be like, I was a tiny bit right and a whole lot of wrong. Or like, I saw a piece of something that was true, but I was missing I was missing it somehow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, take it from the Apostle Paul. We see through a glass darkly. It's like we see something, but it's kind of misted and it's shrouded, and we haven't got the full picture. And we, like you say, I don't even know that we will get the full picture of the other side of it. I don't know what it will be like.
Right.
Whatever happens, my feeling is none of us are going to be standing there thinking, it's pretty much what I expected. It's like,
no, you're right. You're so right. I wanted to ask you along these lines, when you're dealing with apologetics or like talking about doctrines and stuff like that, where do you see the sort of boundary between faith and reason? Because to a degree, having faith in something by definition means you don't have complete certainty. At least that's how it seems to me. And then I do feel like the whole field of apologetics is sort of an effort to bring reason into it. And I know William Lane Craig, his website is I think called Reasonable Faith or something like that.
That's right.
And to some degree, those two ideas, faith and reason, seem counter to each other. But I could also see how you could make an argument that they complement each other. How do you see the duality of those two things?
I think they have often been set up as opposites, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Because if you specifically look at what the word faith, how it's translated in Scripture, from the original Greek and so on, piskes, it's really something more like trust or loyalty. It's got a number of different ways you could actually read it, I think. And so I think inevitably there has been a sort of faith has often by Christians and by atheists characterized as sort of believing something without having any evidence for it, any sort of reasonable evidence for it. And I don't think that is personally the way I understand what faith means in a biblical context. I think we all have reasons for the things we believe. Now, they may not be reasons that necessarily satisfy a Richard Dawkins or someone else. Most people who are Christians, frankly, the kinds of reasons they'll have for being Christians are quite personal. They'll be that I had maybe an experience, but that it's not experience they can prove to anyone else. It may be a kind of just a sense of the rightness of something. Now, these aren't going to be objectively sort of persuasive reasons necessarily for a skeptic, and fully understand that. And obviously apologetics is much more interested in those sort of objective facts about science and nature and philosophy and Scripture that we could maybe objectively look at and ask, does this point in a certain direction?
Right.
Now, does that mean we're abandoning faith when we go in and do that? Well, not exactly. I think we're we're finding reasons for belief, for a particular worldview. But when we exercise faith, it's more about putting our trust in that worldview, that belief. So, I mean, it's a classic example, maybe a bit of a hackneyed one, but the one I quite often enjoyed is there's a story of the magician, what was his name? I've forgotten the name of the guy. Blondie, that was it. Blondin was a guy who used to tightrope walk across Niagara Falls, and he used to string up a tightrope. This was going back a couple of hundred years, and he would one day the King of England came with his entourage to watch him do this, and Blondie walked back and forth across the tightrope, and then he got a wheelbarrow and he pushed that across the tightrope back and forth across Niagara Falls, and then he put a sack of potatoes in and pushed that back and forth, and Blondin came to the king and said, and the king said, "That was wonderful, amazing." And Blondin said, "Do you believe I could put a man in here and push him across the falls?" And he said, "Of course I do." He said, "Okay, get in." And that for me is the difference between sort of trust and belief. The king believed Blondin could do it, but did he trust him? And for me, that's where faith comes into view. It's about putting your trust in something.
Wow.
Are you live a life that actually puts your faith, your trust in this idea that Jesus is Lord? That, and for me, if faith is just kind of ticking the boxes of a set of beliefs and saying, yes, I mentally assent to that view. Well, as James says, even the demons believe and tremble. It's not belief that is specifically terribly interesting, I think, to us or to God. It's what we do with it, the faith that we put in it. And to be honest, you can be I sometimes see more faith in the life of someone living radically in a life of discipleship and service than I do in some person, who's got a wonderful, brilliant argument for God, because I don't think that necessarily the faith is really exhibited in the kind of intellectual arguments. It's somewhere else.
All the people that I find myself most drawn to in life are people whose beliefs are embodied in a way that they're acted out, in a way that's so tangible. I think of some of the people that I know that are strong, Christian believers that have felt compelled to do work overseas in developing nations. I've interacted with, Christian relief organizations that are full of people like that. And I'm just like, okay, like the way that your belief is animating your life, that's compelling to me, because I'm seeing it at work, and
yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate your perspective on that, and I love that analogy, or the story of the Niagara Falls. As a Canadian, the Niagara Falls story resonates with me too. I'm like, all right, we got one.
I've been there. I've seen it. I've traveled on the Maid of the Mist under the falls.
Yeah.
And it is quite a sight, the old Niagara Falls.
It's pretty spectacular.
But coming back to the faith thing, because it does remind me, actually, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. And I had him on my big conversation show. Yeah,
with Susan Blackmore, is that right?
Susan Blackmore.
Yeah.
And
I think that's your most watched video on your channel. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, as you might expect, what with the cult status of Jordan Peterson. Right. But it was a great discussion between them. And and what was interesting was in that instance, I don't think I wouldn't say Jordan Peterson a Christian per se, but he was certainly defending a lot of quite Judeo-Christian ideas and perspectives, and certainly sort of against the kind of more kind of materialist, naturalist sort of view of Susan in that episode. And he quite offended her at one point in the discussion. I remember because he said, he basically said, "You're not really an atheist." And I kind of pressed him on that.
Yeah, atheists hate that.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And fair enough. But basically, his point was basically, you still have faith in something, and it's what he calls the sort of the thing at the top of your, I can't remember the word he uses for it, but
hierarchy. He loves that word too. Yeah.
And that functions as God, essentially.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure I go completely with him on this, but there's an interesting idea that we all, in a sense, devote our lives to something. We all prioritize something. We there's something that is the object of our value and worship. And to that extent, we're all, in that sense, driven by faith.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to prove objectively that any of these things are the way we should live our life, the thing that matters. But we all live life where we have to make a meaning from it, and we have to sort of devote ourselves to some cause or purpose, or whatever it is. And his view was that Susan was doing that in some way herself, and that in a technical sense she's an atheist, but not in the sense that there's no ultimate purpose or meaning to the way she directs her life.
Right. Yeah. I've seen Jordan make that argument with Matt Dillahunty as well, and it went over similarly, I think.
Went down like a lead balloon with him.
I think. Yeah. So it's funny that reminds me of something you said earlier about wanting it to be true. And when I watched that conversation between Jordan and Susan on your channel, Susan at one point talks about, the meaninglessness of life. And she's like, I wake up and I embrace the fact that there's no meaning. And she talks about her body in a very disembodied way, like this body will do these things today. That's just what it does. And I found myself watching that conversation and seeing this choice in front of me, where you have on one hand Susan, who's making this argument for naturalism and nihilism, talking about meaninglessness like it's freedom, and then on the other hand I see Jordan, his perspective is a confusing web of so much meaning, right? It's like it's so much meaning that, like, when he's asked, does he believe that Jesus was the Son of God, he says, I would need 40 hours to answer that question, right? So, but I find myself looking at that as a choice, and I found Peterson's perspective more interesting in the sense that I'm like, I want there to be meaning. I want there. I'm not satisfied with a universe that where there's no purpose, and even deeper than that, it's like right now I feel like if someone asks me, do I believe in God, I feel like the way that I would answer that is, well, I mean, someone standing up in front of a crowd and talking about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, I don't really believe in that God. But I see I hold my son for the first time, and I see how connected I am to him, and how my connection goes back to my father and his father and his father, and not just fathers, but my mother and her mother and her mother, and the richness of this this sort of experience that we're sharing as human beings. And I see all of that, and I go like, if you want to use the word God, then fine. Like, something is going on here. We are a part of a bigger story, and maybe that's just me wanting that, but I do want it, and I see it, and when I study, it's actually Jordan Peterson's one of the people that sort of cracked open the door of belief for me again, where I'm like, well, maybe there's other ways to conceptualize some of these things.
I think I know that not everyone likes Jordan Peterson. And
I know that too, yes.
I fully understand the reasons why. But I have really appreciated actually what he has often brought into what was otherwise a fairly, sort of empty debate between atheists and Christians. And he's sort of come to this middle ground saying, hang on, well, I'm not a sold out Christian by any stretch, but I'm not a devout atheist either. And kind of just putting again on the table the idea of we need things to make sense of our lives. We need story. We can't just demolish God and expect science or something like that to become the thing that gives our life meaning. And I think, I mean, this is part of a much bigger scenario, but I think what he and many others are recognizing is that in the absence of significant cultural narratives, the Christian narrative in particular in the West, we're seeing a fragmentation into sort of lots of different ideas of what the good and the true and the beautiful is, and they're all competing with each other, and people are getting really annoyed with each other about, and so it I think certainly he and others of his ilk are sort of starting to realize when we throw away Christianity, what do we replace it with? It's not, we all live for, we can't live without seeing ourselves as part of something bigger, a grander narrative. And the problem is, what kind of narratives will people replace that with? And they're not all necessarily going to be in tune with what we see as, flourishing for society and so on. So
right, I'm with you. It's a sort of, Peterson sort of, he really goes after the postmodernists.
Indeed.
And he makes some good points. So this is sort of a question I wanted to ask you along those lines, is that, traditionally your conversations have had, a Christian and an atheist. That's sort of it's not all of your conversations are exactly that, but that's sort of the model. As you've watched this sort of movement of progressive Christianity begin to sort of come into sort of having a real presence in the world, people that are identifying as Christian but maybe don't believe all of the doctrines that would typically be associated with Orthodox Christianity the way that we're used to it. What has your perspective been on those views, and how have you engaged with people that are, whether they consider themselves progressive Christians or not, but you would consider progressive Christians?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think the reality is the advent of the internet and social media, everything has thrown the doors wide open to people, to Christians, questioning what they believe about Christianity. And it's far harder, as it were, for the gatekeepers of orthodoxy that have traditionally existed in church networks and elsewhere to sort of impose a particular understanding. And so I think in a way there is just more of an acceptance almost that Christianity is quite broad. And in a way, I think we've moved away a bit. It might be just the circles I run in, but that we move away a bit in particularly evangelical circles from that kind of very hard line. If you don't believe this particular way of understanding Christianity, the Bible, then you're lost and you're an outsider and everything. The kind of farewell Rob Bell kind of view, to quote John Piper from a while back. Yes,
I remember that. Yeah,
I don't see that happening as much. I think there's a little bit more toleration of the fact that, we can rub along with a Catholic if they're broadly, we're broadly in step in terms of our kind of values and so on. We can do things together that maybe, weren't considered doable in the past. So on the one hand, I think that's a cause, that's a good thing, that there's been a sort of a willingness to see the things we share in common more than things. On the other hand, of course, social media also gives a big platform and megaphone for people who don't like other people and their perspectives to argue about it as well. So it's both of those things. I generally find, again, my perspective is that I have lots of friends in both the kind of what you would call progressive Christian camp and in the more kind of evangelical conservative camp. And I kind of rub along well with both of them because I feature them all on the show in one form or another, talking to each other. And where I end up falling myself is, I guess, again, my feeling is very often I'm a fan of that mere Christianity. I'm orthodox in the sense of I believe there are kind of certain essentials, core things that create the identity of what it means to be Christian. I've always taken the approach of being as charitable as possible in areas where I don't see a need to kind of be hard and fast on certain things, though I fully accept that other Christians, will take a different view to that and only feel they can work alongside Christians of a particular persuasion and whatnot. I mean, obviously, to name the elephant in the room, the big issue has been LGBT over the past, forever really. And I think that's a really hard one because it's one where obviously it goes well beyond dry doctrines over whether you believe in this version of the atonement or that, or the inerrancy of scripture. It's
very, very personal.
It's so personal. It's so pastoral. And in that one, I again feature both perspectives on the show. I tend to, if it ever does get debated, it tends to be debated between a Christian who maybe is same-sex attracted but holds to a view that they should remain celibate, and a Christian who is fine with gay marriage or whatever. And in doing that, I am kind of saying, we're going to let you decide. I personally find that I find many Christians who are in the kind of affirming camp, who I find it very hard to deny their very, personal faith and the way in which I see Jesus shining through them. I equally find incredible Christ-like examples of people who have made that choice to remain celibate because they believe that's what the gospel is calling them to. And I would say I just for me, the sexuality thing isn't, though there will be people who severely disagree with me on this one, isn't one where I see that as being a kind of you're out if you take a different perspective on that. It's one where I think there will be disagreements, but I still hope and pray that we can find a way of calling each other brothers and sisters in Christ, even if we have to take different paths in the way that gets expressed in that kind of way. I'm always hoping for the most amount of unity without jettisoning
the things that are core
to our faith. That will mark me as a heretic in some people's books, I guess. But for me,
if you're going to say anything publicly, you have to be willing to be marked as a heretic, because someone's going to disagree with you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not with me sort of nailing my colours to the mast on that particular issue. I guess it's just more, how do we treat each other, given that there are marked differences in the way we talk to each other and get on with each other. And so I'm a fan of absolutely being upfront about what we believe and why we believe it, but trying to be as gracious as we can to people who take a different perspective, trying to see it from their perspective, trying to understand why they would see this issue differently from me, and hopefully, again, having the humility to understand that when we all get to heaven, there'll be many things that I was wrong about, and that John MacArthur and John Piper were wrong about, and Rob Bell is wrong about, and everyone, it's not like anyone has a monopoly on the whole picture. We'll all be standing, I imagine, aware, not thinking, turns out I was right about this, but aware of just how little we actually understood or knew in the first place.
That's a beautiful thought. I know your launching point into that thought was LGBTQ plus issues, but that applies broadly, like everything you just said. I so agree with you that it's important for us to hold this open space of things that we're not sure exactly about, and to value people over positions.
And it's not that I'm against people being sure, about what they have. I'm absolutely fine with someone who really believes that they do have a basis for believing a certain position on LGBT, and someone saying, no, I believe something different to that.
I think where that gets difficult, though,
how we kind of graciously acknowledge each other's being brothers and sisters in Christ, even with those sincere differences in opinion kind of thing.
I think where that gets a little bit challenging is I'm fine with people being certain about things that I don't agree with, up into the point where it starts to do damage to people. And that's where I think some of the progressive Christian movement, or people that are sort of fringe Christian, might push back and say, like, hey, like, I get, that you feel like let's talk about homosexuality as an example. I get that you feel that homosexuality is wrong, but there's some things that belief is causing you to do that I think are harmful to a whole community of people. It becomes a little bit more challenging to sort of live and let live in that situation, when it becomes an issue of justice in a way.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's an area in which the Christian church, the global Christian church, is sort of trying to figure out how to conduct itself.
I agree. And it's incredibly difficult because we even before this became the presenting issue, we lived in a fairly pluralistic culture where there were going to be differences of opinion and different perspectives on how life should be lived. And it is about balancing that kind of right to a personal conscience and way in which you want to live your life and express it and so on, against whether this is discriminating or in some way adversely affecting, psychologically another person. It's without going into particulars, it's very difficult to sort of draw where that line is, where one person's right to a particular religious belief or perspective contravenes someone else's right for, their own personal way they want to live their life and so on. And I think most of the culture wars battles going on are about specific instances of this, whether this Christian college should change its rules to allow, same-sex or gay relationships or whatever on campus, or whether that sort of somehow is a issue of freedom of religion that's being. And I'm nowhere near in the best position to say when one should trump the other.
I find myself not envious of politicians who are actually enacting, legislation that have to sort of parse these things in a way that policy has to be made one way or another, I find myself sympathetic to people in that position being like, well, that's a tough one. You're not going to make everybody happy.
No, absolutely. I think for me, the important thing for Christians, wherever they stand on the issue, is an awful lot less damage will be done in the process if we actually talk to each other and listen to each other. That's easy to say sometimes as a sort of, wouldn't it be nice? But actually, I genuinely think that actually talking and having genuine conversations with people on both sides does help to negotiate those really difficult things. The problem is so often when both camps are basically, we've got our beliefs and it's just all out war, which is basically what you see in the culture at the moment. It's really hard. And that's why, I do the sort of those discussions. We had one earlier in the year, David Bennett, who's a so-called side B Christian, would describe himself as, same-sex attracted gay, but believes in kind of a celibate approach. And he was on with a very progressive kind of perspective from Brandon Robertson, who's
Brendan's a friend of mine.
Right. He's out in San Diego, I think, isn't he?
Yes, yeah.
So again, but really encouraging in the sense to have a conversation between them where they take each other seriously. They obviously have a difference on the way it works out. But my hope being that the more Christians are exposed to that and do that, the less they can go away and just kind of dismiss another person's perspective or do something damaging in the process. I'm not saying anyone's necessarily going to change their mind fundamentally, but it can actually just putting a human face to that perspective, conservative, liberal, whatever, actually does make a huge difference, I think. Yeah,
you're so right about that, because I've sort of had these conversations with some of my Christian friends and been like, hey, like I found that my views on homosexuality changed when I ended up with friends that were gay, like close friends that are not friends as a project, but they're friends because I just genuinely loved them and enjoyed having them in my life. And when you have people in your life that are, sort of identifying in a particular way, it changes the way you view that issue. It comes home. It becomes personal. I've spoken with people who used to be sort of very against homosexuality, and then they had a son or a daughter come out, and it totally changed their perspective on the issue. And so what I love about what you're saying, and also what your whole show does, what your approach in this area has been, is taking us from a place where it's very us versus them, and going like, how can we make the entire thing more us? You know, how can we include more people in this conversation? And we might not agree on everything, but if we start looking at each other as us and not them, then the conversation changes in a way that we're caring about people deeply and not just seeing them as the embodiment of an issue. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because everyone who comes to the show comes with their own perspective. Mm-hmm. And so they will kind of take something different away from it. And, you know, an atheist who comes to listen to a kind of Christian and atheist having a good old debate on the show, they may come away feeling like, yep, I was confirmed in my atheism and that's great. Christian may listen to exactly the same conversation, feel, yeah, I'm quite happy that my Christianity got well defended there.
You're so right.
But what hopefully both will do in the process and over maybe listening to many shows is sort of start to at least understand the perspective of that other side a bit better, get a sense of who the people are that they're talking to, and get a kind of a willingness to kind of not completely write off their perspective, because in a sense they have seen it steelmanned, as you say, and and equally when Christians of different perspectives come on, you know, whether on the issue of LGBT or some other issue that's contested in Christianity, I'm not expecting necessarily the people who come and listen to change their minds in the course of hearing one conversation, and far less the actual people on the show. But I do hope that they will, as you say, sort of come to simply appreciate that the diversity that exists in Christianity isn't necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some forms of Christianity that I think are like we shouldn't celebrate because they can be divisive and wrong or whatever. But that it's worth hearing out different people, and that doesn't mean you'll necessarily change your perspective. But I would expect my progressive Christian friend to be just as open to hearing the perspective of a David Bennett or someone who says, actually, I do believe that, you know, I can live my life in a way that is such and such, because I want both sides to hear each other. It's not as though there's, you know, the traffic only flows in one direction, just as I want a Christian and atheist genuinely hear from each other in that way. And that is a challenge, you know, as going back to what we said right at the beginning, it's not easy listening necessarily, but it does ultimately, I think, help people to kind of appreciate the bigger perspective as well. That there are lots of ways in which God is working through people and Christians in the world, and it's not a bad thing to be exposed to that sometimes.
Dude, that's awesome. That's a great way to sort of sum up your whole perspective and the process that you go through with your show and your book. And yeah, I feel like that's a good place for us to leave it. So
thank you very much for the chance to talk it through.
Thank you so much. Is there anything we missed that you wanted to mention before we go?
Well, only to say the book is available, and you know, little plug at the end.
No, absolutely. And let me add that, you know, while you and I don't see everything the exact same way, when someone asks me for a book on apologetics, I actually do recommend yours first.
Oh, that's
because of your posture, and it's because of the kind and gentle approach you take to these difficult and important issues. And so, you know, for anyone who's watching, listening, if you're interested in apologetics, and, you know, if you haven't really gotten into it too much, Justin's book, Unbelievable with the question mark, is a very, very good place to start.
Oh, well, thank you very much, John. Yeah, so that's available. You can find that online. People want to find the show. If they enjoy podcasts, just look for Unbelievable as a podcast. premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable is our show page. And look out in the coming year for a new season of The Big Conversation as well. We've got some exciting guests and topics lined up for that. And you can find out more about that at its own website, which is thebigconversation.show.
Love it. Justin, thank you so much, man. Really, really appreciate you taking the time today. It's not as early in the UK as it is for me here. But
Well, I appreciate you doing it so early at your time. It means I've been able to fit this in before I have to go and get the kids from school.
Right.
So,
brilliant.
Yeah, less shouting in the background than there would be otherwise.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Justin. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Okay, that was my conversation with Justin Brierley. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in. As you know, every week we highlight a different nonprofit, an organization that's doing good work in the world. And very often I ask my guest to point out one that they feel passionate about. And Justin Brierley has selected an organization doing work in Uganda, which is a country that's near and dear to my heart because I've done some work there as well. The organization that Justin has chosen is called Divine Holistic Ministries, and they provide orphan care, care for women, and vocational training in Uganda. Justin also mentioned to me that they've been very, very hard hit by COVID. So if that's something that you feel like you want to learn more about and potentially donate to, I would recommend it. Go to dhmcharities.org, and there'll be a link in the description below if you're watching on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're listening to this on a podcast. So that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for listening and for watching. I love you guys. Stay curious.